Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is enormously disappointing that government members don't feel that they should, earn their $140,000 salary and actually make a proper speech. You didn't, Mr Ockenbold, actually. The Minister did. And the Minister made a 10-minute speech, and that's very good, although I suspect that had the Honourable Maurice Williamson made the speech, he probably would have truncated it, but it's a bit hard when it's not your particular area and you read the speech that the officials have very kindly written out for you. But I suggest as Chair of the Select Committee, I might have expected a little bit more from Mr Ockenbold, because the point of urgency is that Parliament sits for longer than it normally would. It doesn't actually absolve members of their responsibility to debate legislation in the House and to show that they've taken the time to consider it and to ask the kind of questions that the public have been asking about it. That's not what urgency is. Urgency doesn't mean that we do a job that should take 10 minutes and 10 seconds. And I suspect, and I say, it's not our fault we're in urgency. It's not our fault that House management's been such a shambles this year that the Leader of the House is in a panic and we'll be sitting to midnight on Saturday. We will be supporting this bill to Select Committee, Mr Speaker, and it's the juxtaposition of the previous bill with this one is very timely. I think we're all very aware that any changes to the Building Act need to be seen in the context of the previous piece of legislation, repairing, which was the leaky building solution, repairing a lot of the damage that was caused by an amendment bill to the Building Act in 1991, a bill which in 1991 deregulated the sector to the point that consumers found themselves with very little protections under the law. I mean, Aaron Gilmore's been a builder and an architect and a developer, and in fact I think he wrote the 1991 piece of legislation, so I look forward to his contribution. It's on his CV anyway, I hear. His brother did. This is a new kind of variation on a theme. Right before Christmas, what a gift. Thank you, Mr Gilmore. But the juxtaposition of these two pieces of legislation should not be lost on members of the House, because we need to be very careful when we amend the Building Act that we don't create the same problems that the National Government in the 1990 did, which has seen billion-dollar pieces of legislation having to go through to assist those homeowners whose houses are absolutely uninhabitable, who've lost their life savings that was invested in those properties because of shonky work, shonky materials and legislation passed by a government that allowed that to happen under the guise of the free market and being so opposed to any kind of all regulation must be bad. And that, I suspect, is why when Labor fixed the situation in 2004, we did make the legislation very tough. The extent of the leaky homes crisis was just becoming evident to all the people of New Zealand. The public were crying out for more controls. People who were in the process of having homes built wanted to know that they were not going to fall into the same trap. And we responded with legislation which was very tough and which provided enormous protection. And I think, in hindsight, we know the Honourable Shane Jones, when he was Minister, saw that perhaps the pendulum had swung too far, that the reaction, whilst understandable and appropriate at the time, had caused its own problems as well. And so Labor, when we were in government, Mr Ockenbold, acknowledged that and set in place a process to amend the Building Act again to remove unnecessary blockages in that system and to try and make that process easier and to try and lower the cost of building houses in New Zealand. And so we will be supporting this piece of legislation because we see this as another step in that process of trying to streamline the Building Act where we can. And as my colleague Phil Twyford has said, it is actually a very modest piece of legislation. This is not going to have a huge impact, but nonetheless we do believe that it's a positive step in the right. Well, I look at Mr Ockenbold says it will. Well, I look at the issue of housing affordability. And Mr Ockenbold saying this is going to have an enormous impact?
That's right.
He is, okay. Well, I'm wondering whether I should listen to Mr Ockenbold or Registered Master Builders President Warwick Quinn, who said, like we are, welcome the changes, but said that he doesn't think building costs will fall at all as a result of this legislation. So should I believe Mr Ockenbold or should I believe the President of the Registered Master Builders? Well, Mr Ockenbold thinks he believes Mr Ockenbold, and that's one of the few things he's consistent on, and I congratulate him for it. But I think I'm going to go with the guy who actually does this for a living and knows what he's talking about. with the greatest of respect. And I don't mean Aaron Gilmore. And I hope that my whanaunga Hekia Parata, now she's in a position to mentor younger members, will take Mr Gilmore under her wing and teach him those great Ngāti Porou qualities of humility, modesty, wisdom. These are great gifts that can be bestowed upon Aaron Gilmore by one of our Ngāti Porou, of whom we are very proud, and I congratulate Hekia Parata on her promotion. It is well deserved. Now I've forgotten where I'm up to, Mr Speaker, but housing affordability is a major issue, and this bill was one of the pieces of the housing affordability plan that the National Party said they were going to campaign on. They had tax cuts. They said their first way they were going to address housing affordability was tax cuts. Well, they all went to the wealthy. They all went to people who could already afford houses, so that was a big fail. And of course the budget increased rent for tenants, cost of living's gone up across the board, which all makes housing affordability even further away from being addressed. The second was the government's gateway scheme. Well, that's turned out to be a real fizzer, because not only did this great bold policy only deliver 40 houses, 40 across the entire country in its first year, after Labour and Waring government had identified 1,500 sites in Auckland alone. Apparently it just doesn't work either. That's what the sector are telling me. It doesn't work, but there'll be more to come on that later. And then we had the amendment of the Building Act. And we in Labour absolutely agree that if we can put changes in which still protect consumers, which mean that they're not going to be at risk from shonky buildings, then that's great. And it would be great if we can address some housing affordability through that as well. But as the Registered Master Builders President Warwick Quinn has said, this bill will not do that. If the aim of this bill is to reduce the cost of housing, then that is not going to happen. And so I don't think that members opposite should claim, as Mr Ockenvold did, that this is going to be a panacea for housing affordability, when clearly it won't be. And I really want to endorse what my colleague Phil Twyford has said about the building sector. And this is a sector in crisis. And when you look at what's happening at the moment, you have two things happening concurrently. An incredible housing shortage in New Zealand, not enough houses being built, residential housing, and a building sector that is screaming out for work. A building sector that has seen consents drop through the floor to unprecedented levels. The work is just not there. People are losing their jobs. Building companies are going out of business. Yet, on the other hand, we are facing an enormous housing crisis in New Zealand. Now, you would think that a responsible government that had a plan for the economy, that had a plan to keep people in work and to address the lack of residential housing being built, would say, let's take advantage of this situation, because remember, Labour built 8,000 state houses to replace the 13,000 that National sold. And we did that during one of the biggest housing booms in New Zealand. So imagine when it was difficult to get a builder. So imagine what you could do in a time when builders are screaming out for work. You could really dent that shortfall in housing that New Zealand is facing at the moment. But this government hasn't done that. In fact, what did they do? They slashed the budget for housing this year by more than 80%. Slashed it. So they've completely taken themselves out of that situation. I'm not sure what's noisier, Antolly's jacket or her interjections, but she can read the budget and see that Housing New Zealand have been told that any new houses will have to come out of savings and baseline. Is that really what we should be doing at a time when we have a housing shortage and a building sector in crisis? We're not training apprentices, we're not doing the skills training that we should be doing at this time. We have apprentices being laid off when they could be going back into polytechs to do more work on their qualification, rather than just being let go and wasting the years that we've already put into them. And this government has no plan for building. And that's the important other half of this piece of legislation, which is we support any moves that make it easier for the sector to work while still protecting consumers. This is a modest piece of legislation. And we think it follows on from the work that Shane Jones was doing. But there has to be a plan for the building sector, otherwise all the good intentions in this kind of legislation don't mean anything.
Kevin Haig.